Today, Tom is with us again to talk about his work. His book, Yuppies, is just coming out, and I'm going to let him talk about the book, talk about look back in time, and CL&L played a part, I'm happy to say. So he contacted me and reminded me of that, and some of our students were interviewed for the book. So we're glad we could be of help, Tom, and we're excited to have you with us today. So we turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Judy. Yeah, no, it's great to be back here. I think this is the third time I have presented to this group. The first time was a couple of years ago, was about yuppies. And then the second time, I think, was a year ago, and I talked about politics in Pennsylvania, just because it's one of the big battleground states, and it's proving to be that, I think, even more than we anticipated in 2024. So anyway, so I'm here to talk again, partly about yuppies, but partly a little bit more broadly about the year 1984, which, as I will sort of show you here, I think was a pretty influential year in our recent history. A lot of interesting things happened, and I think there were some significant changes that took place in 1984. So I have a PowerPoint, which I'm going to use to sort of guide us through this, but if you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat, and I'm happy to sort of stop my presentation and we can have a bit more of a conversation. So, all right. All right, are you all seeing a slide?
You're good. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Okay, so the title of this is The Real 1984, Looking Back on the Year of the Yuppie. So let's just sort of dive right into this here. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I have been here before, but if you have forgotten or if there are new faces, just to kind of give you a quick overview of my background. So I'm based just outside of Philadelphia, and I'm a longtime journalist and author. I really spent the bulk of my journalism career at Philadelphia Magazine, including more than a decade as the editor-in-chief. We put out a successful and really good magazine, won lots of editorial awards while I was there, had lots of readers. It was a fun place to work. I left there in 2020, and really since then have been devoting my time to writing, including to still writing for Philadelphia Magazine. And in fact, in 2022, I was named Writer of the Year at the City and Regional Magazine Association Awards, which was a nice national award to get. So, but the biggest chunk of my time hasn't really been spent on magazine writing. It's been spent writing this book, which you'll see here, which is called Triumph of the Yuppies, America, the 80s, and the Creation of an Unequal Nation. This actually comes out on June 4th, so we're just a couple of weeks away from this. I've been working on this for, gosh, almost 3 years. So it's kind of a little bit surreal to me that the day has finally arrived that the world is going to see this. But it's gratifying. So the book, just to tell you a little bit about it, it's really kind of a cultural history of the 1980s. But more specifically, it focuses on the sort of emergence of, young urban professionals, yuppies as they became known, as a cultural phenomenon and a cultural force in the 1980s. So I use them as sort of the center of the story, while I end up talking about a lot of other things that were taking place in what really was a very influential period between roughly 1980 and 1987, when I think a lot of things changed politically, economically, and culturally that really have sort of created the world that we live in today. So it's about yuppies, but again, it's about something broader than that as well. I've been fortunate that I've gotten a couple of early reviews that were really nice ones. Kirkus Reviews, which is an influential early reviewer of books, gave it a starred review and said it was insightful and immensely entertaining. And then also got a starred review from Publishers Weekly. There's a little quote there. So far so good in terms of the rollout of this book. More reviews, I am told, are to come, and there's going to be some author appearances and hopefully more media attention about this. At least that's my hope and my dream. So as with any book, you never quite know until it gets out there in the world, but fingers crossed that people are interested in this as a topic. So if you're interested in buying it, it's available anywhere you can get books, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, a local independent bookstore. everywhere should have this. Okay, let's talk a little bit about 1984. So when you hear the word 1984, the book, I think, is what most of us think of. Just a quick side note, I somehow managed to make it through my entire educational career without ever having to read George Orwell's novel, 1984. But as luck would have it, I took a trip to London a couple of summers ago with my family, and I was at the bookstore in the airport looking for something to read on the flight, and there was a copy of 1984, and I thought, oh, the time has arrived. And I read it, and what a good book. In case you haven't ever read this book, it's as good as advertised. It really was. I will tell you, it's also very interesting to read this book just in our current kind of technological and political climate. It's a very intense story, but it remains incredibly powerful, even though I think it is at least 75 years old at this point. So anyway, my little endorsement for George Orwell, like he really needed that from me. Anyway, we're not going to talk about that 1984. We're going to talk about the real 1984. And what you see here is actually a cover of Newsweek magazine from December of 1984. And they proclaimed 1984 not the year of George Orwell or the year of totalitarianism or the year of Big Brother, but in fact, the year of the Yuppie. 1984 was really the year that Yuppies, young urban professionals, really, as I said, became a cultural phenomenon and a cultural force. And I'm going to get into some of the details of how Yuppies shaped this year. But again, as with my book, this is about what was happening was broader than just young urban professionals. I think 1984 was a year that was transformational economically, politically, and culturally. And again, I think in some ways sort of sets up some of the things that we deal with as a country and a society today. So just a quick kind of preview of where I'm headed with this presentation. I will first give you a very brief history of the world before 1984. I'll go fast. It won't take that long. And then I've actually broken down 1984 into three separate parts. So we're going to take this sort of by season because there were different things going on, culminating with the fall and winter of that year. And then finally, a little epilogue that I think tries to bring us up to date, kind of connect the dots between 1984 and where we are literally 40 years later. So, okay, let's talk about history. And really what I want to do here is really talk about the 1970s, because in so many different ways, the 80s were really a reaction to the 70s, to some extent, except to the 60s as well. But as is true, the pendulum in history kind of swings back and forth on a lot of different things, and one time period is often a reaction to what came immediately before it. So the 1970s, as many of you will remember, were not necessarily a very happy time in America. There were, obviously people were happy, but there were challenges that the country was facing. One of them was the economy. So in great contrast to the 1950s and the 1960s, where you have that booming post-war American economy, where manufacturing is humming, where the average income of the American family literally doubled in the 1950s and 1960s. So it really was a time of real rising prosperity in the country. What was interesting too was that incomes were rising equally across the board in every economic cohort. So it wasn't just like well-to-do people were doing well. It literally was at every part of the income scale was seeing their incomes grow at pretty much an equal rate. So anyway, we get out of the 60s and into the early 70s, and suddenly there are some rougher economic seas. And one of the first challenges was the Arab oil embargo of 1973. Gets caught up in all sorts of geopolitics that I won't get into, but the effect on the United States was that the price of oil zoomed up, which eventually drove the United States economy into a pretty deep recession. Coming out of that, we have essentially a half dozen years of really pretty tough economic times, where we have a combination of both high unemployment and then also high inflation. It's the period that we talk about as called stagflation. But just to keep in mind, the inflation rate, obviously we've had inflation here in the US in the last couple of years, but inflation in that period was well into the double digits. So it was significantly worse and lasted significantly longer than our most recent bout of inflation. So that's happening in the 1970s. The 70s are also a tough time when it comes to politics and culture. There's a lot of sort of upheaval in the culture. So it's the era when where Vietnam is coming to a conclusion, not the proudest conclusion for the United States. So we have the divisiveness of the 60s and early 70s, and then the sort of leaving of Vietnam in the first war that we lost. So there's not a lot of great feeling about that. Obviously, the 70s are a period of Watergate, and we have Richard Nixon being forced to resign because of the scandal around Watergate. And then late in the decade in 1979, we have the seizing of the American embassy in Iran, and the hostages being taken. So again, there's all this sort of upheaval in the United States. There is a sense that not only are we struggling economically, but on the international stage, we're not as strong as we once were in those sort of, not just in World War II, but in the decades immediately after that. So it's a bit of a tough time. And so when we get into 1980, Ronald Reagan comes along. It's the second time he runs for president. And he's running against incumbent Jimmy Carter, whose approval ratings were not very high, to say the least. And again, my assumption is that some of you may have some memories of this period. But when you look back on Reagan, it's remarkable how simple his messaging was in 1980. He really runs on two, maybe three sort of basic components. So the first one is he wants the United States to have a strong defense, and he's going to devote more of the federal budget to building up the military. It's a message that plays well for all the reasons I just suggested about the sort of perception of the U.S. as becoming weaker on the international stage. He also wants the government to be smaller and for taxes on people to be lower. His basic messaging that government is not the solution to the problem, government itself is the problem. And given some of the stumbles of U.S. government in the 70s, that was a message that people were certainly receptive to. And then there was kind of a third element to his campaign where he talked a bit about there are some among us who are not pulling their weight in this economy. And so he would talk about, quote, welfare queens, people abusing the welfare system. He would talk about union members that he thought were just out to sort of in it for themselves, didn't care about the broader good. A lot of this stuff, I think, was exaggerated, but he used it pretty effectively as a campaigner. And I think it certainly swayed some people when he ran for president. So Reagan, there were some questions about whether he was too far right to be elected, but when we got to election day, he pretty easily defeats Jimmy Carter. And in January of '81, he is sworn in as president of the United States. So when he gets into office, there really is kind of a shift in the country in terms of not only federal policy, but some of the things in the culture start to change. So within 6 months, he begins to implement his economic program, which is, as he promised on the campaign trail, he's cutting taxes. Basically, he's cutting federal taxes by about a third over the period of a couple of years, which is not a small tax cut. The theory here, as you may remember, was of supply side economics. That is, if we give more money back to people and to businesses, that money will actually get invested back into the economy, and that eventually tax revenues will actually rise because the economy will grow. That's a completely untested theory, as it turns out, and it was partly true and partly not. And we can talk about that, but that was kind of the theory of the case. Reagan also sort of takes this sort of tougher stance on a lot of things. So I mentioned defense as one of them, but he also shows kind of a tougher stance on some issues domestically. And probably one of the more famous ones is his firing of the federal air traffic controllers in the summer of 1981. Again, some of you may remember this. As I researched this for the book, I mean, I remembered it. I was in high school. I guess it was in high school when that happened, so I remembered it. But I went back and refreshed my memory of some of the details of that. So the situation was that air traffic controllers were negotiating with the federal government. They wanted higher wages. They wanted some better work rules. They were no fan of the Carter administration. And in fact, it turned out they'd actually endorsed Ronald Reagan when he was running in 1980. And Reagan made some suggestions that perhaps he would work with them once he was elected. The negotiations did not go well. They threatened to go on strike. Reagan says, if you strike, that is literally against the law. Federal workers are not allowed to strike. They kind of said, well, we're going to strike anyway. And when they did, he fired some 10,000 of them. And the reason it's significant was that I think it sent a message beyond just federal workers. It sent a message more broadly in the economy that, you know, if labor had had the upper hand in the United States economy in the 60s and the 70s, those days were over. The pendulum, again, talking about a swinging pendulum, is going to swing back away from labor more onto the business side in terms of who has the upper hand in a lot of these negotiations. And then finally, more broadly, there is a shift in this period, in large part because of the struggling economy, to sort of double down on capitalism. There's a sense that government, as Reagan said, has gotten too large, the taxes are too high, that regulations are too onerous. So there's kind of a pro-business mindset that starts to take place. And it goes beyond just pro-business. There's really a shift in how corporations think of what their purpose is. So during the booming economy of the 50s and the 60s, corporations used to talk about the range of stakeholders that they served. So they served their own employees, they obviously served customers, and they served their stockholders. And all members of all those constituencies were important. But really, there's a shift in the late 70s, and as we go into the 80s, that the only constituency that really matters to a corporation are their stockholders. The economist Milton Friedman was one of the big cheerleaders for this kind of point of view, and it's a point of view that begins to become embraced really, as I said, in the late 70s and early 80s. And in my book, I write about this in the context of what was happening at General Electric and Jack Welch, who became CEO in 1981, and really kind of embraces this idea of what they call shareholder primacy, that it's really stockholders and stock price that CEOs should be worried about. We get into 1981 and 1982, we hit a massive recession in the United States. This happens on Ronald Reagan's watch, although arguably it's not Reagan's fault. This is really the Fed that engineers this recession. And it happens because inflation has gotten so out of control that the only way to get inflation back under control after at least a half a dozen years of really high inflation is to raise interest rates really high, slow down the economy, and then let inflation drop back down to a more manageable rate. Unfortunately, and that's how it works out, but there's a lot of destruction that happens along the way. So unemployment rises to over 10%. There are tens of millions of people that lose their jobs over the course of a couple of years. We see bankruptcies and also farm foreclosures that on a level that we haven't seen since the Great Depression in the 30s. What's interesting, and as I discovered as I researched this period, was that as bad as that recession was, the pain was not felt equally across the country. It really hits the hardest in what would become known as the Rust Belt, with the steel industry struggling and in decline, and also the auto industry really struggling at that point. Flint, Michigan, where home of one of the automakers, I forget which one, has an unemployment rate that's over 20%. In contrast, Stamford, Connecticut, which is the home to it's the corporate headquarters for a number of large corporations, they have an unemployment rate that's only about 3%. So even though this is a very deep recession felt across the country, it's mostly a blue-collar recession. It's really hitting America's manufacturing base as opposed to more white-collar workers. And I think that becomes important later on here, as we'll see. So finally, then, on sort of more the cultural front, I guess, this period of the early years of the Reagan administration, the early 80s, are also important because of what's going on with the baby boom generation. So baby boomers, I think many of you may in fact be baby boomers. It's the generation that's born starting in 1945, 1946, right after the end of the war, goes until 1964, which is actually the year I was born, so I'm the final year of the baby boom. By the early 80s, we have the biggest chunk of the baby boom generation that is emerging from school and beginning to start their adult lives. There really is a divide in the generation between those whose educational careers end at high school and those who go on to college. There's a big push in the country, obviously, to send as many people to college as possible, and that really starts to get traction in the late 60s and 70s. So you have this group of folks that roughly half of the baby boom generation goes to college. I don't think all of them actually graduate from college, but roughly half go to college. But the other half sort of either go into military service or they go into working professions pretty much right after high school. Because the economy is so bad in the late 70s, those folks who don't go beyond high school when it comes to their educational careers, they're really facing dimmer prospects than their own parents had. A lot of those manufacturing jobs that many of those folks would have gone into, some of those jobs are drying up. It's a much tougher time for the high school only educated chunk of the baby boom generation. In contrast, these college educated folks, some of whom I should say were part of the counterculture of the late 60s and the early 70s. By the late 70s and into the early 80s, there's a sense that if they want to be successful, they're really going to have to focus on success itself. This is not anything that's going to be handed to you. And so this culture sort of begins around the culture of young professionals, who will in fact become known as yuppies here within a few years. It's really a building around a culture of success. So many of them actually start moving into large cities like New York, Boston, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. They're moving for a couple reasons. One is that, first of all, it's where the better jobs are, in contrast to more rural places. The best paying jobs are actually starting to be in cities at this point. But there's also a sense of enjoying the kind of cosmopolitan nature of living in a city. For many of them, I think it's a reaction to having been raised in the suburbs and the kind of blandness of the suburbs. But you literally have millions of young professionals moving into what had been working class neighborhoods in cities like New York, and really beginning to change some of those neighborhoods. It's a period also too when we're starting to see the economy shift, and this goes back to why those jobs were more in cities than in other places. That it's really, we're beginning to see the rise of what would become known as the knowledge economy. This is not making a living doing something with your hands. This is working in fields like finance or law or medicine or business or marketing. Those things where it's sort of what you know as opposed to what you're actually building. And the entire economy is beginning to shift this way. And this cohort of young baby boomers, young professionals, are the ones who are really kind of most moving into these professions. So by the end of 1983, here's where we are. We are through the worst of the recession. In fact, the economy has started to grow again. It's not growing in every part of the country, nor is it growing in every single sector of industry, but in fact, it's growing. But yeah, we're still seeing that shift away from manufacturing. Young professionals are becoming a force in large part because there are so many of them. The baby boom generation, as many of you may know, was easily the largest generation in American history. And so sometimes just by sheer force of numbers, whatever baby boomers are doing is what everybody is thinking about. So that's becoming true with young professionals as a group. There are just so many of them, and they're doing things in kind of a similar way that they're starting to become sort of a phenomenon around that. And then finally, this pro-business mindset that really sort of takes hold with the Reagan presidency is really kicking into gear. And particularly as the economy begins to pick up steam, there's a sense of, okay, business, that's where we want the country to put its focus. So that's kind of where we are as we're getting into, finally, 1984. So I want to sort of walk you through just some of the seasons of this year and some of the things that were happening. So winter and spring. One of the things that happens really in the beginning of 1984 is that there are two books that come out that talk about what's going on with these young professionals, with these well-educated baby boomers. The first is a book called YAP, the Official Young Aspiring Professionals Fast Track Handbook. So, and the second one, let me just jump ahead here, is called the Yuppie Handbook, the State-of-the-Art Manual for Young Urban Professionals. So these books, they're written by different authors, but they are very similar in the sense of they are taking this concept of these young urban professionals and defining who they are and then poking a little bit of fun at them. As a book and also as a concept here, these books are completely derivative of a book that came out in 1980, which some of you might remember, which was called the Official Preppy Handbook. That was a book written by a young woman named Lisa Birnbach and several other contributors that was really a send-up of old money families, often in New England, and just sort of their very specific ways of living. The fact that they shopped at LL Bean and Talbot's. They had nicknames like Muffy. They belonged to a certain set of social clubs. It was a really hilarious and very well done book. And it became this phenomenal bestseller back in 1980. I actually interviewed Lisa Birnbach for my book, and she was terrific to interview because she had great stories about the period. And we got talking about the success of the official Preppy handbook, and she said it was really twofold. One was it was very, very funny, and people who kind of got the joke really laughed at it. But she said the culture was changing enough that there were some other people that read it not really as humor, but almost as an aspirational guidebook. It's like, oh, I would like to be really wealthy. And so they read it almost to pick up on some of the tips that were existing in that book, which I thought was really interesting. Fast forward 4 years, because that book is such a phenomenal bestseller, publishers across the country are looking to imitate it in different ways. And that's how we end up getting YAP, the official Young Aspiring Professionals Handbook, as well as the official, the Yuppie Handbook.
Jump
Yes.
in. As I remember, you tell me if I'm right or wrong, they were making fun of like the first Bush generation, the real WASPs, the New England type WASPs who went to the elite schools, you know, so it was really mockery, but that's who they were really aiming at, and people really did dress like that and did you know, the plaids. When I went to Smith, they had the little collars with the circle pin and the plaid, you know, skirts, etc. I think that's who the target was. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a very sort of waspy thing. But as I said, there were some people that got the fact that this was a joke and making fun of this group of people. But there are other people that sort of said, well, that looks cool. That's exactly what I want to be. And I think that's what kind of explains the phenomenon of that book. The idea with this book, and actually the more successful one was actually this one, the Yuppie Handbook, is to take that same idea and apply it not to preppies, but to this new group that was being defined as, quote, yuppies, so young urban professionals. And it takes very much the same approach to take many of the things that was becoming true, generally speaking, of this group of yuppies, and to kind of make fun of it in this book. Although similarly, some people are reading it for a joke and other people are reading it because, oh, I'd like to be like this. So on this next slide here, I think I have here's a definition of yuppiness from the Yuppie Handbook. So resides in or near one of the major cities, claims to be between the ages of 25 and 45. Number 3 is the important one, lives on aspirations of glory, prestige, recognition, fame, social status, power, money, and any or all combinations of the above. Anyone who brunches on the weekends or works out after work. And, you know, sorry, didn't mean to jump ahead there. You know, it's a caricature of what was going on with a particular group of people. As I write in my book about yuppies, there were not many people that checked every single one of these boxes in terms of what yuppiness was. There were some people that checked a few of these boxes, but not others. But I think what's important is that culturally, these are the forces that are sort of now in the culture. And so there really was this sense of glory, prestige, recognition, fame, power, money, all those probably in great contrast to the 60s, where the idea of power and money was sort of, particularly among baby boomers, kind of looked down upon. Now it becomes the thing to aspire to. And more specifically, some of the social trends that we talk about here, including brunch and working out at a health club, those are very much kind of a boom that happens in this period. The number of restaurants that open kind of takes off in the early and mid 80s. The number of health clubs that open up takes off in this same period. And so we're seeing just sort of lifestyle habits really sort of change as the yuppies are becoming a force here. So these two books are important because they sell well, but even more important, they kind of inject the word yuppie. There was kind of a battle, ultimately, I should say, between the word yuppie, the phrase YAP, which stood for young aspiring professional, but that kind of loses out. And then there was a third term, yumpie, young upwardly mobile professional. And for a period of a few months, there's kind of a battle between which one of these terms is going to win out. And ultimately, yuppies is the term that wins out. And what happens is over the period of the next several months, not only are these books selling pretty well, but the media is covering the fact that these books have been written and that there's this whole sort of new group of people that out there that are a cultural force. So you see it just being written about everywhere in the media. I went back and I searched newspapers from 1983 and 1984, and I literally read at least 2,000 articles about yuppies that were written in this period. It was kind of astounding that you would just see so much of this stuff being written about. So a lot of it was sort of defining what a yuppie was. Where are yuppies in my particular city? So Good Morning Hub, what's yup is from the Boston Globe. But you would even see it in classified ads. So I put this up here because this is a classified ad. I think it's from a newspaper in Delaware, from someone who just describes herself as an Eastern educated yuppie whose interests include Chinese cooking, foreign films, hot fudge sundaes, swimming, and reading the New York Times in bed on Sunday, which is about the most yuppie thing that you could possibly do. So the word is really sort of getting out there, and it's kind of spreading around the culture, which is interesting. It's kind of a fad, more or less, is what's happening here. And then something else happens, which is going to take yuppiness to an even higher level. So 1984 obviously is an election year. There's a presidential election. Ronald Reagan is up for re-election. And we all know how this turns out, but when you take yourself back to late 1983 and early 1984, the fact that Reagan will be re-elected is not necessarily a foregone conclusion. So Reagan's approval ratings actually bottomed out in January 1983 when the recession really was at its worst. And his approval rating was only 35%, which is in the realm of where Joe Biden, I think, is above that right now. It's where Donald Trump was probably at the lowest point in his presidency. So Ronald Reagan was really not a popular president at that point in his presidency. Now, a year later, he's improved significantly. He's up just above 50%. But at this point, the Democrats still think they have a chance to beat him in this election. There's enough discomfort with Reaganomics, as it was known, that they have a chance to win this election. The front runner for Democrats is Walter Mondale, Jimmy Carter's vice president. He is a very traditional New Deal Democrat. He has gone around the country and lined up lots of endorsements from labor unions, part of the traditional Democratic base. When it comes to things like free trade, he is not a free trader. He's a protectionist. He wants to protect things like the steel industry, like the auto industry. None of these are outside the box positions for Democrats. This is what the Democratic Party has believed at that point for more than 50 years, going back to FDR. So he's very much in that tradition of an FDR kind of Democrat. So he's the front runner, very much the presumed nominee. But there are some competitors in this field. There are actually, I think, 7 or 8 candidates that start to run in the primaries. But the one who starts to emerge within the first couple of contests is this guy, Gary Hart. He is different from the other candidates who are challenging Mondale, first of all, in that he's younger. Hart is in his mid-40s at this point. He's not technically a baby boomer, but he has the kind of vibe of that generation. First of all, he was George McGovern's campaign manager in 1972, before Hart himself got elected to the Senate from Colorado in 1974. Probably more significantly, though, he's very liberal on social issues. So he is pro-choice, he is pro-civil rights, he is pro-gay rights. He's actually much more conservative on economic issues. So he doesn't believe in protectionism when it comes to trade. He's more of a free trader. He's not sure of that when it comes to unions, there's a little bit more ambiguity in his position on this stuff. And he really starts to talk too about the idea that the American economy needs to change. We need to get away from manufacturing to more of a high-tech economy. And believe it or not, he comes from nowhere. I think in late 1983, he's polling at somewhere like 5%. But when the New Hampshire primary comes around, he actually beats Walter Mondale and wins that primary with 21% of the vote. So suddenly, now it's a race. The media, as it tends to start focusing very heavily on Hart, who continues to do well in some of the primaries in the late winter and into the spring. So it really has become kind of a two-man race. But one of the things that the media starts to do when they talk about Gary Hart is that I'm hearing some interference. Is there anyone else hearing this, or is it just me? Okay, it's stopped now. Anyway, the media identifies that the people most supporting Gary Hart are actually what are these young urban professionals that everyone has been talking about, actually that yuppies. So Hart quickly gets identified as the quote yuppie candidate. And very much because his views of politics align with this generation of young urban professionals who, because they are in many cases children of the 60s, they are socially liberal, but because they're very focused on their own careers, they are much more conservative economically. And so what's happening here is that you take this kind of fun sociological phenomenon sparked by things like the Yuppie handbook, but now it's merged in with politics and this Yuppie candidate and yuppies as a political force. And suddenly we see a real explosion of what we might call yuppie mania. And this is what is happening as we go deeper into 1984. This is why I saw more than 1,000 articles written about yuppies in the year of 1984. One of them, as I'm showing here, this is an editorial from the New York Times, I think in late March or early April of 1984, where they declare this, before Newsweek does, they declare it the year of the yuppies. And this is really very much about a changing of the guard when it comes to political power, what they're writing about here. This is a 60s generation, and more specifically, sort of the well-educated portion of the 60s generation, flexing its muscle politically and bringing to the sense a new set of values that are very different from what their parents had. And the Times says correctly that this is kind of a turning point politically. And they're sort of prescient, I think, in declaring this, because it turns out to be true not only later in this election, but I think literally for decades going forward. Just to talk about the campaign for a second, this race really becomes a 2, maybe 3-person race as it goes through the spring. So Mondale, there's Hart, and then Jesse Jackson also remains in this race. He's not winning enough delegates to seriously have a chance at the nomination, but he is clearly the most successful Black candidate we've ever seen up until that point, and he actually stays in the race and is even a factor at the convention. But for the most part, it's a 2-person race between Mondale and Hart, really battling over the direction and even the soul of the Democratic Party. Is it going to be that kind of New Deal version of the Democratic Party that Walter Mondale represented, or is it going to be this sort of more yuppie version of the Democratic Party that Gary Hart represents? Mondale obviously wins the nomination after a long protracted battle, but there's a sense that maybe he hasn't really won the war. And as the Times suggested, and many other sort of pundits suggested, that going forward, you can tell which direction the Democratic Party is going to go in. And in fact, there's a quote here from an editorial in the Indianapolis Star, sort of noting yuppies are a growing constituency. However the race comes out, Hart has demonstrated an important thing conclusively: the growing weakness of the old liberal coalition as it passes rapidly into history, into the past. Again, they're writing that in the spring of '84, and it definitely turns out to be true as we move forward here politically. Okay, so we're into the summer. We have Walter Mondale has secured the nomination, but there's other stuff happening in the country here that I think is also important in terms of not just this year, but where the country is sort of going forward. So one of the most significant things is that there's kind of a new optimism and new patriotism taking hold in the country that year, and I think it's based on a couple of different factors. The first is this show of military strength that was very much part of Ronald Reagan's campaign platform, and also the way he governed when he got into office. So, there's an increase in defense spending, and there's a real sense rhetorically of Reagan standing up, particular to the Soviet Union. I think it's in 1983 that he refers to the Soviets as the evil empire. So there's a sense of greater strength. One of the other things that happens, though, and some of you may remember this, is that the United States invades the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada. there is kind of a communist regime in charge there, although Grenada is a very, very tiny place, and there's an overthrow of government, and the details of what happened are not particularly important. But Reagan decides to send in the troops in the fall of 1983. He does it presumably because he says there are American medical students there, and he doesn't want to see them become hostages the way the hostages the way the embassy workers had become hostages in Iran in 1979. And so he sends in sort of this fairly massive show of force. And within about 5 minutes, we have, conquered the island of Grenada, in large part because they have an army that's 1,500 soldiers, and we have sent in literally tens of thousands of troops. So despite the fact that this isn't much of a military battle, though, it plays very well across the country. There, I think, in such contrast to the defeat in Vietnam, into sort of the embarrassment or humiliation of the Iranian hostage situation, there's this show of American strength, and it plays very well in the country, and this goes to this sort of burgeoning sense of patriotism that I don't think the country had really seen in decades. So that's going on. At the same time, 1984 is an Olympic year, and in fact, the Summer Olympics are hosted in Los Angeles. In part because there is a boycott by the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries of the Olympics. The competition is not as great as it might normally be, and the United States absolutely cleans up in all these events. So we won a record 174 medals, and there's a sense of just American patriotism and American pride. On top of that, previous Olympics had been big money losers. They had been sort of government operated. The U.S. took a different approach in 1984, and we kind of ran this as a private enterprise. Put a business executive, Peter Yuppie, in charge of the games, and lo and behold, it actually turns a profit. So it's not only does the U.S. perform well on the track and in the pool and on all the different venues for where the games are held, but speaking to the strength of American capitalism, we make money while we do this. So people are feeling good about that as well. And then finally, there's the economy, which really, generally speaking, is taking off. The inflation of the 70s is now gone. Unemployment rate has dropped significantly. And overall, we are seeing growth really not seen since the 1950s. So there's very much a feel-good thing that's going on in America. Wall Street, the Dow has gone up significantly since it hit a low point in 1982. Corporate mergers are happening all over the place, which is generating profits for Wall Street traders. And a lot of those young professionals that were so intent on being successful, many of them were working on Wall Street, and they're very much focused on making money. I interviewed sort of a Wall Street banker from a previous generation for the book, and he said there was a palpable shift in Wall Street in the early 80s, that very much there was a sense of younger Wall Street bankers with a sense of really what's in it for me. There's a sense of I want to generate as much wealth for myself as possible, which he said was a different thing than what you had seen on Wall Street in the 60s and 70s. All of this, I think, leads to kind of a general air of excess, really in the summer of 1984. So we have the yuppie phenomenon happening. Restaurants are opening. People are spending money at restaurants. People are going to gyms and getting buff. It's very much the era of the Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Let's have and Jane Fonda. Let's be toned. Let's be fit. Let's buy expensive stuff because that's something says something about your status. Let's focus on money and careers. A lot of this is captured with a song that Madonna put out that year, the song Material Girl. She has a video that kind of sort of makes fun of this, although it's not quite clear. But the whole period is sort of captured, I think, in this idea of materialism, making money, flaunt what you have. That's kind of the vibe of this whole year and very much this whole summer. Okay, so finally we get into the fall here, and we're going to get into the general election campaign. And there's Walter Mondale. He goes into the convention. He is at least 10 points down in the public opinion polls. He needs to do something bold to shake things up. And so he chooses Geraldine Ferraro as his vice presidential candidate. She's the first woman ever to be nominated on a major ticket. He gets an initial boost from her. In fact, his polling ratings jump about, I think, 7 or 8 points in the week after the convention. So it's, what he's done seems to have worked. The problem becomes there quickly becomes some questions about the ties of Ferraro's husband. Was he somehow tied to organized crime and the mafia? So a little bit of that boost he gets starts to tamp back down. At the same time, he starts announcing that he's actually going to raise taxes, which you might admire him for his honesty, because he says this is the only way we're going to close a pretty big budget deficit that Ronald Reagan, that happened under the Reagan administration. But of course, winning an election while saying you're going to raise people's taxes is probably not the, saying you're going to do this is probably not the smartest move politically. What this race ultimately turns into is kind of a battle between Reaganomics and New Deal, the economy of the New Deal, the sort of traditional democratic liberalism. Are we going to be free traders, or are we going to be protectionists? Are we going to be pro-business, or are we going to be pro-labor? That's kind of the choice that Americans are being faced with as they go into this election. There is a big battle for all those yuppies out there. There's such a cultural phenomenon. There's a sense that they're very influential. And so both candidates are very interested in capturing this younger baby boomer demographic. Ronald Reagan does it in part by he starts to invoke Bruce Springsteen. Now, Bruce Springsteen is not a yuppie, although he is part of this younger generation. But Reagan sort of, in a not particularly elegant way, just starts to plop Bruce Springsteen into some of his speeches, kind of thinking, well, this will show, I know what the kids are listening to. And there's a sense that maybe that worked, but the one person it didn't work for was Bruce Springsteen himself, who very much came from a working class background, was not a fan of Ronald Reagan. And I detail some of this in the book because I just thought it was so interesting that Reagan mentions Springsteen in a speech or two. Springsteen gets word of this, and he's on tour with his most popular album at this point, Born in the USA. He's a huge cultural figure. And so he starts to talk about it in his concerts. And here's one of the quotes from Bruce himself. He's sort of rejecting Reagan, and he sort of mocks Reagan by saying, I wonder what his favorite album is. It probably wasn't Nebraska, which was all about sort of hard economic times and people driven to desperate things. But then Springsteen starts to talk more broadly about the American dream. And I thought this was an interesting quote. So there's a promise getting broken. Bruce says, in the beginning, the idea was we all live here a little bit like family, where the strong can help the weak ones, the rich can help the poor ones, the American dream. I don't think it was that everybody was going to make $1 billion, but that everybody was going to have an opportunity and a chance to live a life with some decency and some dignity. And I think that's an interesting definition of the American dream, because I don't think it's the only definition of the American dream. And I think a lot of what we deal with as a country is, what do we mean by the American dream? So this is Bruce's version of it, which is everybody can live decently and with some dignity. I end up in my book also quoting a different version of the American dream by none other than Robin Leach, the host of the show Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, which was also becoming hugely popular at this point in the mid 80s. And he's a Brit, and he has this sort of view of America of, it really is about, you have the opportunity here to come and make a lot of money. And he talked about Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous as very much a celebration of capitalism and what it could do for an individual human being. I'm not sure that there's a right answer to this question of what the American dream is, but I think those are two sort of different poles of it that I think sort of, again, pendulum swinging. We might go back and forth between those two as a country in how we think about what that bigger dream actually is.
Tom, just
Yes.
on the American dream, part of that, what I always remember hearing was that each generation would do better than the previous generation. You would have a house, a car, a family, and
Exactly.
at a relatively young age.
Yeah, and I think that had certainly been true. The post-war generation is certainly doing well better than the generation that were adults during a depression. So there was that sense. I think you're right. I think that's a really good definition of the American dream. So, all right, back to our presidential campaign. So Reagan comes up with this brilliant ad, the Morning in America ad, which some of you may recall, but there's just a sense of capturing all the good feeling that is going on in the country. We have been through these very hard economic times of the late 70s and the recession of the early 80s, but now the sun is rising. We can all feel good again. It's morning in America, vote for Ronald Reagan. Terrific, terrific ad. We get into the debates for the general election, and there's a first debate where Ronald Reagan, who at that point is in his, so I think he's 73, he does not have a good night. He seems a little confused by some of the questions. He stumbles as he speaks. Very much not a strong performance. And there's suddenly a sense that maybe Walter Mondale actually is back in this thing. Maybe this can be a race. 2 weeks later, we have the second debate, and Reagan is much better prepared and ultimately handles this moment in one of the great political, it's brilliant, brilliant politics. The question of whether, in fact, well, how's this for irony, given where we are today, whether Reagan is essentially too old to be president. Should he be elected to a second term, given his age? And he says, I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience. Everyone who's at this debate just falls out of their seats laughing. Walter Mondale can't help but laugh. It's just brilliant politics. The age issue has now been put to the side. Reagan does well enough in the second debate and the third one that any concerns about his age or this issue are gone. And by the time we're voting, this is what we end up with. So Reagan wins. I think this is the largest landslide in American history, maybe first or second. He wins 49 out of 50 states. Walter Mondale only wins his home state of Minnesota. Reagan gets 59% of the popular vote and wins by 17 million votes. So there is a very strong sense of where the country wants to go. It is very much on board with Ronald Reagan and what he's done. And simultaneously, I think it is a very strong message to Democrats that the New Deal approach that had lasted Democrats for 50 years, well, maybe America has moved on from that. Maybe we're done with those policies of being pro-labor, of trade protectionism, and maybe we are really ready to go in a different direction. So let's talk about what happens next, or maybe just the end of 1984 and some of the stuff beyond this, because there's a little bit of an interesting twist, I think. So at the end of the year, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, Newsweek, sort of echoing the New York Times, proclaims 1984 the year of the Yuppie. Now, again, given all the stuff that's gone on in this year, this is pretty significant. So it could have been the year of Ronald Reagan. It could have been the year of the economic comeback. It could have been the year of the Olympics. But instead, Newsweek says it is the year of the Yuppie, and really identifying this cohort of young professional baby boomers who are well-educated as really the significant thing that's taken place during this year of 1984. This is a little bit long. I'm not going to read all of it, but I will tell you that, so it's talking about this generation of baby boomers and what they've been through in the 60s and the 70s. But as it says, now there they go again, barely looking up from the massive gray columns of the Wall Street Journal as they speed toward the airport, advancing on the 80s in the backseat of a limousine. Now, there's some rhetorical flourish here. This is not meant to be taken literally, although there's plenty of those Wall Street traders who I think were literally doing exactly that. But there is a sense of generationally, this is where this generation has gone. They are very focused on career, on money, on the fast track, as it was then known. And that is the sort of driving cultural force in America as we get to the end of 1984. What's interesting here, and I give credit to Newsweek because they point this out in their cover story, that while yuppies are part of the baby boom generation, they are by no means actually representative of the entire baby boom generation. So you might remember some of that divide I mentioned earlier between baby boomers who went to college and those whose educations basically stopped at high school. Well, that divide really starts to show itself as we get to this point. So the true definition of a baby boomer, according to Newsweek, is not some young power couple living in a nice loft in Manhattan. It's a married couple who lives in an apartment in the suburbs, and they have, demographically speaking, 1.5 kids and 1.5 cars. So it's nowhere near as fancy as the yuppie phenomenon would give you that portrayal of baby boomers. More importantly, over the previous 4 years, median income for families in this age group of 25 to 34, their income actually fell. So all that money that's being made on Wall Street and in corporate America, they're not seeing much of it. Their lives are getting harder economically. And Judy, back to your point, compared to where they were, to where their parents were at exactly the same age, that sense that they should be doing better than their parents. In fact, they're doing worse than their parents. So there really is this split, despite the fact that we're calling this the year of the yuppie and one segment of the generation is doing, I think, very well. You actually have a larger part of the generation that is struggling economically. And I think that's important because, again, it's about this divide that's really developing in the country along educational and economic lines. And there's a sense of an upper class, or at least an upper middle class, that's really becoming much more powerful in the country, as opposed to the middle class or the working class, that I think there was a sense that they had the power in the more immediate post-war era. So there's really a shift in power that I think has taken place here in the 80s, and I think specifically 1984 is where you really start to see it. Just to sort of take us from 1984 to where we are today, because I think this divide remains really, really important. Over the last 40 years, we've continued in that shift away from a manufacturing economy, so lost more than 12 million manufacturing jobs. A lot of those jobs have been converted into service industry jobs, but as on average, service industry jobs pay far less than manufacturing jobs did. So if you come out of high school and get a job, you're not going to necessarily get a job in the steel mill and make middle class wages. You're going to get a job doing something else, and it's going to be a struggle for you. We see this big shift when it comes to wealth. So, or I should say, first of all, before we get to the wealth, just the wages at the very top versus those in the middle, there's really a significant shift in the last 40 years. Top 1% of earners, they see their wages grow up 200% over the last 40 years, whereas people in the bottom 90% see their wages grow just 29%. So that divide is really taking hold here. The map I put up here is actually not a political map. Those are not red states versus blue states. What this is the economic breakdown of the United States. This map might be a couple of years old, but I think it's still generally true. So the red areas are where people are living, below the median income in the United States, or the average income in the United States. And the blue area is where it's significantly above. So there's a lot more red on here than blue. And you can see that the blue areas tend to be around, you can spot where some of these large cities would be. So it's New York, probably down into Philadelphia. In New England, you see Boston, Chicago. It really congregates around large metro areas where a lot of the rest of the country economically is in a very different place. Again, to get past just wages and talk more generally about wealth, by 2016, and again, this is a few years old, but it certainly still holds true. Families at the top controlled 79% of all wealth in the US. That's up from 60% in the 1980s. Meanwhile, the percentage of wealth held by the middle class has gone from 32% down to 17%. So we've seen this really pretty big shift away from the middle and the bottom towards the top over the last 40 years. There are lots of reasons for this, but I think in part it is the economic policies that really took hold in the 1980s. But I also think it's some of the cultural stuff that took hold as well during that period that I think has continued onward since then. Now, I think we have seen a backlash towards some of this in the last several years. I think, ironically, you see it both on the left and the right. So on the left, I think the emergence of someone like Bernie Sanders as a really powerful political figure is in reaction to this income inequality and wealth inequality. And his version of how we get out of it is closer to democratic socialism. But I also think on the right, the rise of Donald Trump and MAGA is in some ways a reaction to this as well. Trump certainly has an appeal to blue collar voters who in large part, I think fairly feel like they've been passed over for the last several decades. A lot of those manufacturing jobs that have disappeared. And I think also culturally, some of those folks feel like they've been kind of stepped on by people living in cities, sort of imposing their views of things on the rest of the country. So I think we are dealing with the consequences of what's gone on back in the 80s very much to this day. And, we're going to have another election this year and we'll see where this ends up going from here. But I think in a lot of ways, we're still fighting these battles that really were started back in the 1980s. So, all right, I'm going to stop here. I'm hopeful you might have some questions or some comments or some thoughts about this, and we can chat a little bit. about all
Okay,
this.
it would also be great just to hear people's memories of yuppies, whether you were a yuppie, identified with yuppies, detested yuppies, or whatever. What flashes in my mind first, sort of the yuppie, well, particularly for women, the yucky, that was an interesting Freudian slip, the yuppie uniform with the, the white blouse, the little bow tie, and women on the positive side, I thought were having more careers and were in work, and you were told not to look too feminine, that you were supposed to wear what was like, you may remember the language, you probably do better than I do, Tom, but the regular suit, in fact, and it was just intensely rigid and boring. Anyway, that's what comes to mind for me. Can you comment at all on how they presented themselves?
Yeah, no, I think you put your finger on something that's really important. So you're right. You're seeing this huge influx of women into the workforce and into professional jobs. I actually have a section in my book that's coming out that talks about the dress code. And part of it was based on, you may remember this, there was a book called Dress for Success that
Right.
came out in the 1970s, and then it was very popular. But then there was a sequel that came out a couple years later that was called Dress for Success for Women. And I'm blanking on the author's name, but his prescription in this book was exactly what you described. Dress basically in this very conservative way. Your idea is twofold. First of all, you do not want to look like a secretary. So you want to distinguish yourself from other women in your office. And secondly, you don't want to draw too much attention to yourself as being different. You want to be seen as fitting in your sort of corporate and executive material. And you do that by not with anything with flourish, something instead that's basically boring, as you said. And I mean, I think it's understandable that women did this. I mean, women of your generation and are you're pioneering, right? You don't want to take too many chances that you don't want to take because no one has ever gone down this path before. So I think you
And,
put your finger on something dressed.
and you
The other
certainly
thing I
should.
would say,
Go ahead, sorry.
no, I was going to say the presence of women in the workforce is also really significant, not just in terms of the dress code. It's significant in the sense of suddenly you have families or couples where you have two significant incomes, and particularly before couples have children, we have the emergence of what we're called DINKs, double income, no kids. And so these are suddenly couples that have a lot of disposable income. And so that's why they're able to go out to nice restaurants 4 nights a week, or they're able to buy a BMW or the most expensive version of whatever it is. So some of that materialism is a factor of women working and families suddenly having more disposable income than maybe that their parents' generation had.
You mentioned DINKs, and acronyms like that were very, very popular.
Yeah, the author was John Malone, wrote Dress for
Right,
Success. It was an
that's
interesting,
right.
yeah. And I went into Dressing for Success as a business because I had read the book. So,
Oh,
Thanks for the comment. I went back and I reread those books, or read them. I had never read them initially. And what strikes you now, particularly about Dress for Success for Women, is it reads very sexist now to our ears. But again, I think if you transport yourself back to 1978 or whenever that book came out, it was actually very practical advice.
as it was.
I had just transferred, I was in my early 30s and in the early 80s, and I had just transferred out of education, went back to get my MBA, and came out and worked in marketing, but specifically in advertising. And I can tell you, I remember this book coming out because there was such a reaction among, now again, I was very lucky to be in advertising because there was such a reaction to this whole concept of the yuppie female dressing in suits with little bow ties and so forth, so that we actually went out of our way to avoid that kind of dressing. And I remember, because of the book and because of the jokes that were being made everywhere, and the worst thing you could do was walk to work on the streets of New York wearing a suit and a bow tie and your sneakers. And, that was sort of the uniform that we reacted against. So it was a fun time also, though. How do you still stay somewhat professional looking, but avoid that yuppie look?
You said it was one of the worst things you could do. Did people make fun of you on the street?
Oh, no, no, no. I'm just saying, when you saw jokes on television or
Ah.
in comics or articles that, for example, that Tom showed early on, and, just people reacting to the yuppies. I was definitely, although I was yuppie with children, because I started having children in 1981.
Quickly mention, those of you who lived in New York back then, remember the transit strike. And that's when, forget about regular shoes, just forget it. Everybody was wearing what was considered totally unacceptable before. You were wearing sneakers, and that became a big deal.
You stole what I was going to say. I was so relieved. I did wear what I was supposed to, the suits with the bow tie and all that, because I had gotten myself into a very professional career to my surprise, and I wanted to obey every rule. However, after wearing heels every day, that was what I was supposed to look like. When former Mayor Koch walked across the bridge in sneakers, I was so happy to wear sneakers. I was able to walk to work. I didn't have to take the bus. But I do remember some advertisers coming to our office and saying, you wouldn't wear sneakers, because I was wearing heels in the office. And I pulled out a drawer and I showed him my sneakers. I said, I sure do. I put comfort ahead of everything. It was a fun time. It was a really crazy time. You didn't know what you were doing as far as dress code was concerned. You sort of flipped from one to the other. You got tired of looking so rigid, and you put on a dress once in a while. But that was very rare. You were afraid you weren't going to be taken seriously. That was it.
It's true. Barbara, you wanted to comment? You have to unmute again. Can you unmute?
Yeah,
There
it's
you
ironic because seems like every person is wearing sneakers. Perhaps out of 10, 9 people are wearing sneakers today for comfort. And the streets in New York, as you know, have lots of potholes. And
Mhm.
I put my heels away for a while.
Yeah. And then, of course, sneakers or walking shoes became popular. They became fashionable. What I remember from that era too, I'm a little bit older than the boomers, is people, and I include myself in a lot of how they affected my thinking, were separating themselves, and you touched on this, Tom, from their parents' generation. Like, oh, that's the Depression. We're not like that. We don't think that way. They, held back, and they wouldn't spend any money. And I remember when I started my business in the 80s and was doing well, a friend of mine said, you should go out and buy a mink coat. And I thought, why would I do that? Yeah. But that was her biggest advice to me. It was like, live it up. And remember the Reagan years where, all the elegant dress and the fancy parties at the White House and everything. It was just a total break from the past, I think. Yeah. So you're muted, Tom. I don't know if you want to say something, but yeah.
Sorry, I muted myself because my neighbor is cutting his lawn. So hopefully you're
Tell him
that.
not to do that.
But
Okay, anyway.
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, part of the fun of this book for me was going back and just researching so much of the early 80s. And as I saw the way people were dressed, and I remembered this, people look really nice. They look very sharp. And as I walk around even Center City, Philadelphia now, I'm like, oh, I kind of miss the days when people dressed up a little bit more. Now everybody's in a pair of, sweatpants and sneakers, or, maybe not quite that bad, but there was something about the let's put on a nice appearance that I personally sort of miss.
Yes, well, you're perfectly right. If you go to the opera, you see people in sweats now. It's disgusting.
That's true.
Most of us put on a nice appearance.
Right. Yeah. Of course, some people love that. I have trouble convincing Bernie to wear anything other than blue jeans. But anyway, I'm wondering, Tom, what kind of feeling did you come away from all this research? What feeling did you have about yuppies? Did you find them, to be honest, something somewhat ridiculous? Did you feel you had some affection for them or felt sorry for them? Anything that you can tell us?
I probably to some extent all of the above. Obviously I'm trying to distinguish here between broader cultural phenomenon and any individual person. Because I talked to literally dozens of people that lived through this period. Kathy, including you, I thank you for the conversation we had. That was great. And most people, what they're thinking about is living their own life during that period, right? You're just making decisions for yourself or your family or trying to get forward in your career. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. I think what I took away though was that the broader cultural shift and really that divide that I talked about is that while one part of the country or one segment of the country is doing fairly well, there's a whole other segment that's really not doing well at all. And I think people really did get left behind in a way that the country was making a choice. And I think, given where we are right now as a country, I think sort of the chickens are coming home to roost to some extent. So, I mean, I don't come away completely denouncing yuppies as saying every choice they made was terrible. And in fact, some of that stuff is fun and it's very defensible and it's fine. But what I'm trying to get at in the book is sort of the broader things that were going on, whether it's culturally or certain policies that we had or certain mindsets that were sort of taking hold in business, in business and on Wall Street and so forth. So those are my stronger feelings there as opposed to any individual yuppies.
Well, it's great to have this look back and the fact that you've extended it to what the impact has been and how it still plays a role. It's very easy, I think, for people to say, "Oh, that's the past, forget about it." And but you're right. I think that you make a good, strong connection there. That it's still important in American society and how it's divided people. I have a quickie question. I don't know. Do you think Donald Trump, I'm not asking your view of him now, but do you think he was a yuppie of sorts back then?
Well, he certainly looked the part, always dressed in a power suit. And yeah, he's very much part of that yuppie culture. I think what's maybe a little bit different about Trump is that, a lot of yuppies came out of a sort of more socially liberal college experience, protesting against the war, that sense of we're going to change the world. And I don't think Trump was ever part of that. I think he kind of came his own way up through college. But certainly by the 80s, he's very representative of that flashiness, that money, that kind of thing. So it's certainly ironic that he ends up as a political candidate really appealing to people who were in many, many ways the opposite of that. It's a bit of a head scratcher to me, but they see something in him that obviously resonates with them, that somehow they think either despite or because of the fact that he made a lot of money, he's on their side. So it's an interesting.
Yeah, I think they see what you say, they admire that and envy it. And on some level, he doesn't talk down to them or he makes them feel he's part of them and that appeals to them. And the phrase I remember back then, this is not about Trump per se, is if you've got it, flaunt it, just why not without any kind of embarrassment. So we're not quite back to that now, but some of the divisions. So yeah, it's interesting how things divide. Well,
I went back and just one quick about Trump, just one thing. I went back and read a number of articles about him from the 80s that were published in the 80s. And one of the things he said with his real estate hat on is that he saw that the middle was disappearing. He said there are no middle buildings anymore. So that's why he's building Trump Tower, because he said there's Trump Tower and then there's something way on the other end of that. There's no reasonable middle, as I think there had been in decades before that. And I thought just metaphorically that sort of spoke to me about what was happening overall, that there's no middle anymore, right? It's just getting divided into top and bottom.
Interesting and very overtly flashy.
Yeah.
I mean, on purpose, you know, gold, everything, etc. And a lot of people related, admired, envied it, etc. Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, thank you. I was going to say a blast from the past, but also bringing it up to date. So Tom's book will be coming out very soon. I'm looking forward to reading it, and we thank you so much for coming back to us. We wish you lots of luck with the book, and we hope this is not the last time you'll be here with us. Anyway, so come on back.
Thank you for
Okay,
that. Thank you for your attention, and thanks for that invitation. I'd love to come back. So thank you all.
Okay.
Take care.
Take care.